This session is our very first in the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre's Politics and Action series for 2021. We'll be discussing the latest political updates in Singapore. Before we get started though, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm dialing in from today, who are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We acknowledge the tradition of custodianship and the law of country on which the University of Sydney campuses stand. And I would like to pay my respects and the respects of the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre to those who have cared for country in the past and for those who continue to care for country and those who will continue doing so in the future. So welcome to everybody who's joined us. I'm thrilled to be able to moderate this session on the latest political updates from Singapore. We have a very special presenter joining us who I will introduce in a moment. Before that, I just want to give you a quick rundown of how this is going to work. Our presenter, Dr. Elvin Ong, will have about 15 minutes to give you the broad strokes of what is happening in Singapore at the moment and what's happened over the last year. We will have a limited time for questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A function as the talk progresses. Also, we will be live streaming this event on Facebook, so you can catch what Elvin is talking about there if you have any issues with your Zoom. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest speaker for today. We're very lucky to have him, Dr. Elvin Ong from the National University of Singapore. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the National University of Singapore. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the Centre for Southeast Asian Research at the University of British Columbia, attained his PhD from Emory University and his MPhil from the University of Oxford. He has been awarded a number of accolades, including in 2019 being named Dan David Prize Scholar in Defending Democracy. And he was the 2018 Young Southeast Asia Fellow. So he has a lot of knowledge and wisdom to share with us today. And so with that, I'd like to pass the mic on to you, Dr. Ong. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for taking time to be here, and thank you to the University of Sydney for inviting me to give this presentation on Singapore today. So I'll spend about 15 minutes talking about three different topics today. First, how Singapore dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic over the past year. Second, how Singapore conducted the elections in July 2020, and briefly discuss the key highlights of the election results from a historical perspective. And third, how Singapore is facing an uncertain political transition. That is a very recent development, and we are all very interested in what's happening right now. So on COVID-19, this graph from the Ministry of Health shows the trend of COVID cases from the beginning in March 2020, just up till 2 days ago on Monday. And there are a couple of things to take away from this graph, right? So first, we can see the government implemented a circuit breaker lockdown period from April to June 2020. And this has been very effective in bringing down the overall number of cases occurring within Singapore. Second, we can see the different colored bars of COVID cases that we have detected in Singapore occurring in different settings. So the red bar are the number of imported cases. The yellow bars are the number of cases occurring within the community. And the blue bars are the total number of cases occurring within the foreign worker dormitories. And we can see here that the vast majority of COVID cases have been occurring in these foreign worker dormitories. Now, these are typically dormitories that are housing foreign construction workers or workers in the oil and gas sector. So they are crammed in these dormitories in pretty bad ventilated conditions. And so there is no wonder that many of them have been affected at the initial start of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in fact, there are some latest estimates which show that out of the 323,000 workers in these dormitories, an estimated half of all of them have contracted COVID, right? Now, if we zoom down to look at each of these three settings separately, we see a much clearer picture, right? So the graph here shows the number of imported cases over time. And we can see before the circuit breaker, there were many imported cases. There were none during the circuit breaker as the country closed its borders. But as we gradually open our borders after the circuit breaker, we can see more and more imported cases. But bear in mind that these are all detected during their 14 days of quarantine held when they were doing their quarantine at dedicated hotels, government mandated dedicated hotels in Singapore. The second graph here is what we see are the community cases. And here is where we see the circuit breaker being very effective in reducing the amount of transmission over time. So more recently, we had seen a growing number of community cases with a small peak around here, and we are very much actually concerned about that. So the government has actually implemented some steps to try to tamp down these a growing number of community cases. And these community cases were in part driven by leaks from the imported cases. And finally, we can see we have foreign workers in dormitories in the last graph here. Now, I would like to point out that the scale of this graph is really very different, right? During the peak of the circuit breaker period, the number of cases in the foreign worker dormitories were about 1,000 per day, right? But amongst the community at the peak, it was only about 50 to 60 per day. Now, over the past few months, we have successfully brought down the rates of infection in these foreign worker dormitories. We can see that the rates of infection are extremely low, almost non-existent. And that is because the movement of foreign workers in these dormitories have largely been very much controlled. They can only go to their work site, be it a construction site or a marine offshore work site, and they come back to the dormitory and nowhere else at all, right? So some people have made some noise about this policy, but by and large, most Singaporeans seem to be accepting of it. Now, keep in mind that in July 10th, we still had some COVID cases occurring in the community, but that did not stop the government from organizing elections. The People's Action Party government had until January of 2021 to organize elections, but they decided to hold elections early anyway because the PAP wanted a fresh mandate for Singaporeans to try to fight COVID. So elections were held, but there were a significant number of restrictions. One of the key restrictions was that all public rallies were banned. This meant that for both the incumbent PAP and the opposition parties, they could not hold any mass rallies at all, where thousands of people would usually gather in a stadium or in a football field to listen to candidates speak on a platform, right? But despite the restrictions, candidates could still organize some public walkabouts, such as standing at a market or at a train station and try to distribute flyers and talk to certain constituents and voters on a one-to-one basis. So with the restriction of mass rallies and physical campaigning, what really stood out was that the campaigning of the Singapore elections raged online over social media. What a lot of political parties did was they did live YouTube and Facebook streaming sessions. There were a large number of social media posts on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. There were a lot of debates on it. And some people have described this as Singapore's first truly online general elections. Now, of course, every election has its fair share of controversies, and this election is no exception. And I would like to just highlight some of these controversies, which kind of sort of indicate, I feel, about how Singapore politics has generally developed over time. So one of the first controversies which exploded online is, for lack of a better term, what I call the Elvin Lim incident. What happened was that the People's Action Party had a press conference to parade its new candidates. They hold multiple of these press conferences to introduce different batches of candidates. And immediately after Mr. Elvin Lim was introduced as one of PAP's new candidates, many people started coming out online to say on social media that, oh, we know him, he has a bad character, and somehow he was not deserving of being a PAP candidate. And eventually he was withdrawn as an election candidate. So I think in some ways, this episode goes to show how there may be some internal problems in the candidate renewal process within the PAP, and that is something we should watch out for further into the future. The second incident I want to highlight is what I generally call the 10 million population incident. What happened was the Singapore Democratic Party, the SDP, which is one of the major opposition parties, one of the major manifesto items was that they did not want to have Singapore have a 10 million population. And they claimed that the People's Action Party actually wanted for Singapore to have a 10 million population in the country. And so during a televised debate, the PAP minister in charge, Mr. Vivian Balakrishnan, who was the representative of the PAP at that time, totally denied having this 10 million as a population target, which eventually resulted in the SDP somehow declaring victory, right? That they have successfully pushed the PAP from not having this population target. But regardless of whether you think that's it's a true claim or not, I think this episode just goes to show how immigration and integration is still a very salient and problematic issues for Singaporeans. And I think this is something that we will have to look very closely for moving forward into the future. And lastly, the third incident, again, unfortunately, there's no proper way of framing this incident. I'll just say it's the Razia Khan incident, where a new candidate from the Workers' Party, Ms. Razia Khan, had to publicly apologize for a racially sensitive tweet that she had made a couple of years ago. Now, most people will say whether the post she made on Twitter is racially sensitive or not. Really depends on which generation you come from. For the younger generation, they may see the tweet as, well, nothing really much about to do. Whereas the older generation might think that her tweet was pretty offensive. So I think this episode goes to show how younger generation of Singaporeans have a different way of thinking about how race and religious issues as compared to the older generation, there might be a certain generational gap between how these two generations think about race and religious issues. Now, in terms of results, we can look at the PAP's performance from a historical perspective. And we can see a couple of things from this graph. First, we can see that in terms of vote share, which is the lower light gray line, that it was the PAP's third worst performance. Right? There were worse years in 1991 and in 2011, but all in all, it was the PAP's third worst performance in terms of vote share. But in terms of seat share, which is the dark black line at the top, it was the PAP's #1 worst performance, right? For the many years in the past, the People's Action Party has won more than 90% of the seats in the legislature. And for this year, that percentage just dipped to below 90%. And so from that perspective, this election results were really kind of a historic, right? Where the opposition made historic gains. And finally, of course, we also know that we can see from this graph that there's a high disproportionality between the vote share and seat share for a couple of reasons, particularly due to our unique electoral system. Number one, that's because we have a first past the post electoral system. And we also have what we call these group representative constituencies, where there are multiple candidates standing as groups within these constituencies, combined with the gerrymandering that has occurred over the successive election cycles. That is why we see a lot of this disproportionality happening. When the PAP gets about 61% of the vote share, but they get like 89% of the seat share. So overall, from this historical perspective, the PAP did somewhat badly in the July 2020 general elections. And the main opposition party, the Workers' Party, did very well in contrast historically. It retained the 6 seats that it already had in the past from the past election, and then won a further 4 seats, giving them a total of 10 seats in parliament. Now, these 10 seats may seem quite little as compared to other countries around the world, but in Singapore's context, this 10 seats is historical, right? No opposition party in the history has ever even come close to 10 seats. The best performing loser amongst the opposition parties was the New Progress Singapore Party. It was a new party formed by former PAP Member of Parliament, Mr. Tan Cheng Bock. And although it did not win outright any seats, it won 2 best loser seats that are known as non-constituency Member of Parliament seats. This means that still represented in Parliament, but they have reduced powers over certain matters, over certain voting powers for legislation. And finally, we know that in the East Coast constituency that was helmed by former future Prime Minister Heng Swee Keat, the PAP won, but they won it very narrowly because 46.6% of voters actually voted for the Workers' Party. Now, if you want to learn more about the historic elections, there are really plenty of reading materials out there. There are at least 4 books now out on the elections, and I hope that the University of Sydney Library has ordered copies for all of them. And now I just want to mention that previously mentioned that the future Prime Minister Heng Swee Keat, the future Prime Minister, was deemed to be Minister Heng Swee Keat. And he is the future Prime Minister during the elections because in November 2018, he was actually chosen by the PAP as the PAP's 4th generation leader. Right? The 1st generation leader, of course, is Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. The 2nd generation leader is, of course, Mr. Goh Chok Tong. The 3rd generation leader is, of course, current Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. And the 4th generation leader was supposed to be Mr. Heng Swee Keat. This meant that he was going to take over the current Prime Minister if the Prime Minister decides to step down. However, just last month, in April 2021, this future Prime Minister, Minister Heng Swee Keat, somehow decided that he no longer wanted to be the 4G leader. He no longer wanted to be the future Prime Minister. He cited his age. He is 60 years old this year. His health. He has previously had a stroke, but he has recovered quite well. And he also cited his short runway, presumably because he is 60 years old, and that's why he didn't have long enough of a time to implement policies that he wants before and after he becomes Prime Minister. So all this has thrown the leadership renewal plans of the PAP quite out of whack. And what the Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong had to do just at the end of last month was to implement a cabinet reshuffle, where Minister Heng Swee Keat has to step down as Finance Minister, and in his place, Minister Lawrence Wong took over to become Finance Minister. Minister Chan Chun Sing took over to become Education Minister, and the current Transport Minister, Mr. Ong Ye Kang, took over to be the Health Minister. And so these 3 people, Mr. Ong Ye Kang, Mr. Chan Chun Sing, and Mr. Lawrence Wong, are deemed to be the front runners to be the next future Prime Minister of Singapore. Now then, the question is, who actually is the front runner? The problem is that everyone appears coy, no one knows for sure. There is also the problem is that the process of choosing the leader is fairly opaque. There's often the phrase used that the Prime Minister is the first amongst equals, but nobody really knows what that kind of choosing the first amongst equals process really means. There was previously an institutionalized process that was mooted by former Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong. Most people appear to have forgotten about that process. So the situation that we find ourselves now is quite a lot of uncertainty. And there are a couple of analogies which some people have suggested that would describe our situation now. Some people are saying that we are in a Game of Thrones situation. So other people are saying that we are in a Death of Stalin situation. Now, whatever movie or television series you like is totally up to you. But what we do know is that this leadership transition will take a couple of months, maybe 1 or 2 years to resolve itself. And until then, we don't really know how the process will actually play out. So thank you, everyone. That's all I have.
Thank you so much for that, Elvin. That was very enlightening. I have a couple of questions here that I'm going to put to you now. The first one that we've got from Gavin. Yes, very interesting one, given those charts that you showed us at the beginning of your presentation. His question is, what misgivings have been expressed publicly in Singapore in regards to the conditions under which guest workers stay in the country? And I think that's particularly pertinent looking at the statistics of COVID infections that were registered amongst that particular population.
Yeah. So I think there has been some misgivings amongst non-governmental organizations who are very much concerned about the welfare of these foreign workers who are staying within these dormitories. They are allowed to go to their work sites, as I mentioned, and brought back to the dormitories. The government has made pains to explain that, oh, even within these dormitories, there's a lot of activities they can do. There are some of these dormitories are well equipped with, say, movie theaters and basketball courts, where they do have place to move, but all confined within these dormitories. So a lot of people have been discussing about the mental health issues that these foreign workers have, and as well as the anxieties they face from not being able to meet up with their friends outside in public. But at the same time, again, the government has taken a lot of pains to try to explain to people that this is something that we need to do to keep the COVID cases low, and that is really nothing much else that the government can basically the timeline for potentially relaxing these constraints has to be continually monitored over time. And the government may do it over time, but with the small spike in cases that we have in the community, that timeline seems to be probably going to be drawn out quite for the foreseeable future.
Just following on from that, Elvin, I actually, maybe a number of participants have seen the recent government public service announcement about getting vaccinated, and noticed that it's been doing the rounds on social media.
Right.
How is that rollout going? And is the community on board with that? Was there a particular impetus for the government to put out a public announcement like that? How's the vaccination rollout going?
I think the vaccination rollout is proceeding fairly smoothly right now. Currently, what we are seeing is that the rules are that all the adults above 45 years old can book an appointment to go for their vaccination. But supplies have been limited due to the shipment issues that the government is facing with Pfizer and with Moderna. So I think the latest news is that those below 45 years old can expect to be able to book appointments when June comes around. So hopefully that that will be good news for the rest of Singapore. I think the fancy video that many of you saw go around in the social media, I think that one is simply the part of the government to try to, again, encourage more people to go for the vaccination and not hesitate, right? If you are allowed to go for the vaccination, just go ahead.
Thanks. I've got another question here, a slightly different topic, back to the elections. This question reads, how did first-time candidates do in this latest election across different parties? For GRCs, how did the GRC teams with more or less first-time candidates go as well?
In Singapore, I don't think there's that much of a distinction between the success rate of first-time candidates across different political parties. As you can see from my graph, the PAP wins like close to 90% of the seats, right? So this means that if you are a first-time candidate for the PAP, you are more or less likely guaranteed to win. Yeah. Of course, on the flip side, if you're a first-time candidate for the opposition party, then what are your chances of winning? And again, I think the results speak for itself. For the Workers' Party, if you're a first-time candidate, there's a higher chance for you winning as compared to almost no chance at all for all the rest of the opposition parties. For the Workers' Party success, the 10 seats, what we see is that many of them have been previously candidates in the past. So the voters are familiar with them, and therefore the Workers' Party is confident of putting them up again, so as to allow voters to vote for them as a signal of also for party renewal, because the Workers' Party also allowed some candidates to retire this time around.
Interesting. And I have probably our final question for this session, I'm afraid, but one here also on the topic of the elections. The 2015 general election saw a big win for the PAP, and the 2020 general election saw big gains for the opposition. It could be said that many pundits and the media and both the PAP and the opposition all read the results wrong ahead of these two different general elections. What does that say about reading voter sentiment in Singapore?
I think it says that don't believe people like me when I say something. Look, I mean, a lot of people are in the business of, like, crystal ball gazing and trying to decipher, and trying to predict what will happen in the future. And social science can do certain things, but I don't think prediction is at the top of the list of things that social science can do. So I would say always probably take all the predictions of voter sentiments with a large pinch of salt. And most of the time we can probably only rationalize backwards instead of rationalizing forwards.
And that's probably good advice for many places around the world, not just Singapore.
Yeah.
I'm going to end it there because we do have another session coming up, which I will talk about in a second. But thank you so much, Dr. Elvin Ong, for joining us. That was the perfect 15-minute summary of what's happened in the last year in Singapore. You did a great job of keeping to time as well. I didn't even have to jump in to cut you off at the end there. So thank you so much for that. For our participants, if you are joining us for our Indonesia country update, you can head over to that website. We'll be opening over to that Zoom. We'll be opening it very soon. It'll be a very similar format. I look forward to seeing you there and at other country updates for our Politics in Action event for 2021. Thank you so much for joining us.